American sports tickets are expensive. And I don't mean a little bit expensive, like olive oil or British train tickets. I mean really expensive, like extra virgin olive oil or HS2. If you're not American, which 96% of the world isn't, then you might not realise just how expensive American sports tickets have become. The average ticket to a regular season NFL game costs more than $300. The best seats, not even including hospitality, will set you back over $500 on average, and even the very cheapest tickets in the NFL, in what are sometimes referred to as the nosebleed seats, cost an average of around $170. For the Super Bowl, which is the most expensive major event in all of world sport to attend, tickets started at $950 in 2025, of which there were vanishingly few actually available, and rose to over $20,000 before even hitting the resale market. The NFL tends to be where you find the highest prices, but in the NBA, the average ticket still costs over $200, at over $700 on average to watch the Lakers, with NBA Finals tickets typically ranging from $1,000 to $1,500, and MLB World Series fixtures fetching similar fees. Likewise, if you're an American, which 4% of the world is, then you might not realise just how much cheaper sports tickets are. Well, pretty much everywhere else in the world. In the Premier League, which is the most watched league in all of world sports, the average matchday ticket costs around £45, which is equivalent to about $60, and the average season ticket, which includes all 19 of your team's home Premier League fixtures, costs £521, which is about $700. That's less than the cheapest Super Bowl ticket, the average NBA Finals or World Series ticket, and indeed, the average regular season LA Lakers ticket. It means that watching 2 NFL games, on average, costs about the same amount as watching an entire season of Premier League football. NFL tickets, therefore, are between 5 to 8 times more expensive than Premier League tickets on average, depending on whether you look at matchday or season tickets. And that's just regular season tickets, which is how the Premier League title is decided, but not the NFL, of course, where Super Bowl tickets cost several times as much as even the most expensive non-hospitality Premier League season tickets. And the Premier League is the most expensive league in Europe. The average La Liga ticket costs about €40 or $47. The average Serie A ticket costs roughly €35 or $41. And the average Bundesliga ticket comes out at just shy of €30 or less than $35. Season tickets at Bayern Munich, one of the biggest and best supported teams in all of world sport, start at €175, rising to about €850 for the most expensive. Meanwhile, matchday tickets start at €15, rising to €80 for the very best centrally located seats. A €175 season ticket at Bayern Munich works out at about $12 a game. This discrepancy between American sports tickets and those found throughout the rest of the world is nothing new, though it has grown most rapidly in recent years, but it has made international headlines recently in light of FIFA's exorbitant pricing for tickets to the 2026 World Cup. The majority of group stage tickets by volume are priced at over $400, with final tickets now costing a minimum of $4,185 for the worst seats, and $8,680 for the best non-hospitality seats, which accounts for most of the stadium. FIFA has defended the sky-high prices by citing the price of tickets to other major American sporting events, with a spokesman telling The Athletic, quote, "The pricing model reflects the existing market practice for major entertainment and sporting events within our hosts on a daily basis." End quote. I don't think they're referring to Mexico. This is, obviously, a cowardly and baseless defense of the indefensible. There was zero requirement for FIFA, a charity, it's worth remembering, who set ticket prices independently of the host nations, to price gouge supporters just because other American sports do the same. It is the moral and intellectual equivalent of Gianni Infantino becoming morbidly obese, buying a pickup truck, and shooting up a school, and defending it on the grounds that he was just embracing American culture. I mean, Sure, you're not technically wrong, but it's hardly an offence, is it? But just why are American sports tickets quite so expensive? And why are the attitudes of some Americans, by no means all but a very significant number, to outrageously expensive ticket prices so different to those of sports fans in, well, Europe, South America, Africa, Asia, Oceania, other parts of North America, and, though I haven't done the necessary research to say for certain, probably also Antarctica. There are three leading theories as to why this might be the case. The first is that Americans are richer than everyone else, so they can afford to pay more for sports tickets. The second is that Americans are more cucked than everyone else, so they won't complain or collectively organise when billionaire owners bleed them dry. And the third relates to a complex web of corporate structures, sponsorships, and tax write-offs. We'll take them in chronological order, one by one. The leading theory, at least from an American perspective, is that the price of sports tickets in the United States reflects the affluence, prosperity, and spending power of Americans compared to people anywhere else in the world. This is an argument which is not entirely without merit. Since the 2008 global financial crisis in particular, which was triggered somewhat ironically by the collapse of the US housing bubble and the failure of major American financial institutions like Lehman Brothers, America has enjoyed greater economic growth than most of Europe, as well as other developed countries like Japan. US GDP has basically doubled since 2008, whereas the EU, and the UK's, you have to combine them since we have since left the EU, their GDP has risen by about half that amount over the same period. The result is that America has gone from being roughly on par with wealthier European nations economically 15 or 20 years ago, to being richer, and even significantly richer, than them by many metrics now. So, US GDP per capita is about $90,000 versus $47,000 on average throughout the EU. US PPP per capita, which is often a more useful metric, despite sounding funnier, is still $90,000 as the US is the benchmark, compared to $65,000 on average in the EU. And gross household income in the US, also as measured by PPP, stands at over $67,000, compared to $59,000 in Germany, or $48,000, in both the UK and France. Apologies if I have just bamboozled you with far too many numbers and statistics there. PPP means purchasing power parity, and it is just a way of measuring the price of specific goods in different countries, and comparing their absolute purchasing power. But what all of that means is that Americans are close to twice as wealthy as Europeans, as a collective on average in absolute terms, and 30 to 40% wealthier in terms of household income, adjusted for actual domestic spending power. Some of these disparities are eroded by America's unrivaled abundance of microtransactions, and much weaker welfare state in some cases, in addition to specific higher costs of living in certain areas. But where an even bigger discrepancy appears, which has an even bigger impact upon the price of desirable sports tickets, is in terms of the very richest. America is also a lot less equal than Europe, on average. The US has a Gini coefficient, which measures income and wealth inequality, of about 40, which is similar to developing countries like El Salvador or Iran, and higher than literally any single country in Europe. Bulgaria, which is the poorest country in the EU by GDP per capita, is the only European nation which comes close. Meanwhile, the EU's average Gini coefficient is about 29 to 30, which is similar to Canada's. What that means is that there is much more poverty in the United States, about twice as much as the UK by most metrics, for example, even post-austerity, crippling problems like medical debt, high rates of rough sleeping, and significantly lower life expectancy. This isn't the sole factor for all of these problems, of course, but it is one of them. I mean, the federal minimum wage in the US still stands at an absurd $7.25 an hour, but it also means that the US has a much larger social strata of very rich people, in absolute terms, than anywhere else in the world. About 18% of American adults earn over $100,000 a year, whereas only 5 to 6% of British adults earn over £75,000 a year, which converts to around $101,000. That's not an exact comparison due to PPP, which would be more like £68,000, which between 9 to 10% of Brits earn in excess of, but a real gap opens up among ultra-high earners. Approximately 800,000 Americans earn over $1 million a year, versus just 30,000 Brits who earn in excess of £1 million a year. Even adjusted for per capita, currency conversions, and PPP, you are still looking at about 0.2% of Americans who earn over $1 million a year, versus less than 0.05% of Europeans overall, and sub 0.1% even in some of Europe's wealthiest countries. There are certain European countries with equivalent or even greater numbers of millionaires and billionaires per capita than the US, Monaco, Switzerland, and Sweden, for example, but they have relatively small overall populations when compared with either the US or Europe as a whole. The richest 10% of Americans own an estimated 79% of the nation's wealth, and the top 1% between 30 to 35%, versus the top 10% of Europeans, who own around 55 to 60% of the continent's wealth, and the top 1%, roughly 25%. The richest 10% of Americans have an individual annual PPP of about $95,000 versus $63,000 in Germany or $50,000 in the UK. I'm almost done with the stats, I promise. About 8.5% of Americans are dollar millionaires, which is comparable to the wealthiest European nations like Switzerland and the Scandinavian countries, close to double the rate of either France or the UK, and about 3 times the European average. This bleeds into the cultural argument, which we are about to come on to, but this is significant because, whereas in Europe, and indeed most of the world, there is a view certainly of mass participation sports like football as being cultural goods which ought to be open and accessible to as broad a section of society as possible. In the US, attending major sporting events is viewed as a luxury, and therefore the preserve largely of this elite class of very high earners, and perhaps the upper middle classes, on very special occasions. The wealth of America's top 10%, and especially top 1% therefore, is more significant when thinking about the price of sports tickets than the nation's overall wealth or average incomes, because only the rich are paying several, if not tens of thousands of dollars for Super Bowl tickets. This is not even a remote possibility for the vast majority of Americans, over half of whom have less than $10,000 in savings, which is roughly the price of a Super Bowl ticket. Unlike attending an FA Cup final, or even a major European final like the Champions League or the Europa League, which is undoubtedly a very expensive day out, especially factoring in travel and accommodation expenses, which would require saving up for the vast majority of football fans, and is still therefore exclusionary, but to nothing like the same extent. I've got quite into the weeds here about pay, purchasing power, and disposable income, because there has been widespread discourse and, at least from what I've seen, widespread misunderstanding online, on both sides of the Atlantic and elsewhere in the world, about how much richer Americans are than people elsewhere in the world, both on average and in terms of America's comparatively large, ultra-wealthy and super-high earners. With all of that having been said, another reason why I went into quite so much detail is because none of that fully accounts for the gap in ticket prices for sporting events in America compared to everywhere else. Even when there was parity between the UK and the US in terms of GDP per capita back in 2008, both around $48,000, and the UK had higher PPP per capita, US sports tickets were still significantly more expensive for comparable events than British or English ones, or German, French and Dutch ones for that matter. What's more, whilst America's GDP per capita has risen by 275%, and Americans have become 20% richer in real terms, on average since the 1990s, with broad inflation of around 150% during that time, the price of tickets to sporting events has significantly outstripped overall inflation, real-term wage rises, and even executive pay. The example that I used at the beginning of this video, of Bayern Munich, is an especially useful one. Bayern Munich, are one of the biggest football clubs in the world. They are literally the biggest sports team in the world in terms of paid up members. They are by far the biggest and most successful club from the biggest and the richest country in the EU, and they have over twice as many social media followers as any American sports team, and over 7 times as many followers as the best supported NFL team. Munich is also among the most affluent cities, and Bavaria among the most affluent states, within one of Europe's most affluent countries. Munich has an approximate PPP per capita of between $80,000 to $90,000, which is similar to Seattle or Dallas-Fort Worth, and Bavaria around $70,000, which would put it just below Texas and Maryland, but just above Virginia and Kansas. From a purely economic standpoint, therefore, in terms of incomes, disposable incomes, and supply and demand, Bayern Munich ought to charge similar ticket prices to the Dallas Cowboys, the Kansas City Chiefs, and the Baltimore Ravens, if not more in fact, given that they have a significantly larger fan base overall. And yet, they don't. And it's not just that they don't charge quite as much, they operate in a completely different universe. The city of St. Louis, by comparison, and the state of Missouri, is poorer than Munich and Bavaria, as measured by PPP per capita, and even GDP per capita in terms of the two cities, yet tickets to watch St. Louis City SC, a club that only began playing professional football in 2023, in their opening game of the 2026 MLS campaign against Charlotte FC, will cost you anywhere between $78 to over $200 for a non-hospitality ticket. Clearly, therefore, economics alone cannot explain why American sports tickets are so expensive. It could explain a 1.4x increase, possibly a 2 to 3 times gap, or even a 4x gap with a hyper-focus solely on the uber-rich, but what we see, typically, isn't a marginal increase in line with incomes or PPP, or even a doubling or trebling based upon the wealth of the super-rich, but a roughly 10x increase across the board, and up to 25 to 30x increases in terms of major events. So there are, evidently, several other factors that need to be taken into account. In the case of the NFL, one is simply that NFL teams play fewer matches than most football teams, and indeed most other US sports teams, only 8 or 9 regular home games a season, and there are only 32 NFL teams throughout a nation of 340 million people, which means that they often have huge catchment areas for a small number of fixtures, which further drives up demand. A second, arguably even more significant consideration, which impacts all Major League sports tickets but is, once again, most pronounced within the NFL, is the influence of corporate entities and sponsors. Whereas in European football, to give just one example, there are large and often highly lucrative hospitality sectors within stadiums, especially at the biggest clubs, referred to in Britain as the Prawn Sandwich Brigade, which are populated by corporate clients, commercial partners, sponsors and the like. You can, for example, pay £5,000 for a single ticket at Man City, over £50,000 for a single box at a single game at Arsenal, or, according to some reports, as much as £2.5 million for a box for a full season at Anfield, which works out at about £13,000 per person per game, should you wish. But in American stadiums, this phenomenon isn't restricted solely to relatively small hospitality sections. In some cases, it is practically ubiquitous. There is routinely outrage, and rightly so, when only 50,000 of the 86,000 tickets on sale for the 2024 Champions League final, for example, are made available to supporters of the two clubs who reached the final, split 50-50 between them. A further 10,000 went on general sale to all football fans via a ballot, and the remaining 26,000, approximately 30%, reportedly went to UEFA sponsors, corporate partners, broadcasters, UEFA guests, or were sold as hospitality packages. This was deemed grotesque by most European football fans, again, rightly so, but it was practically communist. I mean, they might as well have handed them out for free to the most loyal supporters, compared to the distribution of Super Bowl tickets. Only 1 to 5% of Super Bowl tickets on average, no, you heard me right there, 1 to 5% will ever go on sale to the general public, priced at the last Super Bowl at between $950 to over $20,000, with the remaining 95 to 99% of tickets distributed directly by the NFL to teams, broadcasters and sponsors who, for the most part, then relist them on resale websites for between $5,000 to $50,000. I know I won't be alone among European viewers in balking at those numbers, and I'm not referring solely to the prices. Major American sporting events are packed full of corporate clients who calculate that they will recoup the money invested on wining and dining their customers and clients in the long run, and who, unlike ordinary people and supporters, can write off the cost of the tickets as entertainment or marketing expenses for tax purposes. Whilst American sports tickets are eye-wateringly expensive, in other words, in many cases, no individuals are actually buying these tickets, and many of the people at these games haven't paid a penny at all. It's not that this doesn't exist outside of the US. The entire middle tier at Wembley, known as Club Wembley, is basically catered to this exact corporate client. It is just far more prevalent in the US, and therefore has a much more distortive impact upon pricing. The prevalence of ticket touting and resale websites, likewise, isn't unique to the US, but it is absolutely unique in terms of extent. You can go online and buy tickets to Premier League matches via third-party resale websites, but only a tiny number of tickets at the average Premier League game are actually distributed like this, and in actual fact, in the UK, as in many European countries, ticket touting of this kind, for profit, is actually illegal. I still remember in 2011 when Conservative MP Sajid Javid, a man who later became Health Secretary, Home Secretary and Chancellor, called ticket touts classic entrepreneurs and stated in relation to them that, quote, "If the tickets are priced at £20 a head and sold by touts at £100 a head, perhaps that could be avoided if the club priced the tickets at the outset so there was not a mismatch between supply and demand by selling them, for example, at £100. End quote. This is the prevailing wisdom in American sports. In Britain, everyone called Javid a massive knob, which, again, they were right to, because he is. 15 years on, thankfully, no one listens to Sajid Javid, and most football tickets still don't cost £100, and touts only make up a tiny percentage of the overall English football ticket market. And so we come to the issue of culture, which has been bubbling under the surface throughout, but cannot be contained any longer. I am always cautious about painting in too broad strokes about entire countries and cultures, partly because roughly a fifth of my audience is American, and about the same percentage of channel members, so I have a vested financial interest in not accusing an entire country of being obese truck-driving school shooters, which I may have briefly forgotten about earlier in this video. But in all seriousness, the narrative of the European mind or the American mind cannot comprehend X, Y, or Z when we are talking about vast countries and continents of hundreds of millions of people, and not homogeneous monoliths, doesn't make much sense. At the same time that I see Americans on social media calling Europeans Europores for complaining about $8,000 football tickets, while they themselves are also subject to these insane rip-off prices, if indeed they can afford to pay them at all, there are Americans in my replies and DMs who have been saving up for years to watch a World Cup come to their country, something which only happens once every 3, 4 or 5 decades if that, but whose dreams of attending has been yanked out from beneath their feet by unprecedented FIFA price gouging, and who are just as outraged as anyone else. Now, having said that, and it is an important caveat, there is something that is, again, if not uniquely American, then certainly uniquely widespread in America, about some sports fans who will not only tolerate very high ticket prices, but will almost champion and celebrate them, wearing it almost as a badge of honour. You will even see supporters mocking other teams' fans on the basis that their tickets aren't sufficiently expensive. The fact that we can charge X amount proves that we're great, often appears to be the logic, as opposed to, hey, hang on a minute, if we charge X, then Y amounts of people will never be able to attend, and even those who can afford it are being bled dry, typically by multi-billionaire owners, despite the stadiums themselves often having been built at great taxpayer expense through threats to relocate the team to a different city or state entirely, but with all of the profits still being retained by the teams, leagues, and multi-billionaire owners, as opposed to being redistributed to the city, state, or people who actually paid for it. This is bizarre and quite uniquely American. It is as though someone heard the critique of advanced capitalist economies effectively practicing socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor, a common critique, and thought, how can we most ludicrously and comically illustrate this point? I know, we'll have ordinary people pay to build an asset, in the form of a stadium, which often cost billions of dollars themselves, which they will never be able to attend or derive any benefit from whatsoever, while the billionaire owners retain full ownership of the stadium and all of the proceeds of exorbitant ticket prices. This, laughably, is defended as the so-called invisible hand of the market, which just mysteriously and invisibly picks the pockets of ordinary taxpayers and then redistributes vast amounts of public money into the hands of billionaires. In response to 2026 World Cup ticket prices, some Americans on social media, and I'm sure some non-Americans, have argued that fans being fleeced and only the rich being able to attend games is inevitable, like the tides of the seas or trees shedding their leaves. And, with that attitude, it is inevitable, isn't it? If you accept that high demand means high prices, and that nothing can ever be done about it, then obviously nothing will ever be done about it. If you try and charge Bayern Munich fans €500 for a ticket, just because market forces dictate that you can, it is just basic supply and demand, then Bayern fans would riot, and the Allianz Arena would probably be set on fire. It is just basic arson. And again, they'd be right to. We don't have to engage in hypotheticals here. Time and again, when European clubs try to hike prices, supporters push back, and if they do so forcefully enough, invariably, they gain concessions. They might not get everything that they want. I still think that Premier League tickets are too expensive on average, but they get a damn sight more concessions than American sports fans. I remember 10 years ago, when Hull City hosted Liverpool, the away end was less than half full, or over half empty, depending on your perspective on life, because my club, Hull City, had set prices for Liverpool fans at £50. The Spirit of Shankly, a Liverpool fan group, had urged their members to buy children's concessionary tickets for £10, as opposed to the £50 adult tickets, and to simply boycott the game. An estimated 1,500 Liverpool fans, who were no doubt desperate to see their team live, followed their advice, threatening to do the same in the future if prices were set too high. They hit my club, Hull City, where it hurt therefore, with empty £10 tickets obviously far less lucrative than a sold-out away end of £20 to £30 tickets, as well as sending out a clear message. Liverpool fans weren't alone. Between 2013 and 2016, the Football Supporters Federation, or FSF, an organisation which used to represent football fans in England and Wales, launched a campaign titled 20's Plenty, which, as the name suggests, lobbied for away tickets to be capped at a maximum of £20 for adults and £15 for concessions. The campaign received mass support, and though they didn't get exactly what they wanted, away tickets were capped at £30 in 2016. Despite significant inflation since then, and heightened demand for tickets, Premier League clubs recently voted in favour of retaining the cap for the 10th successive season. Not through the goodness of their hearts, it should be said. Half of these clubs are owned by venture capitalist American billionaire hedge fund freaks now, but because they don't want to rock the boat or face fan unrest if they attempt to hike prices. A year after the Hull boycott, about 10,000 Liverpool supporters walked out in the 77th minute of a game at Anfield in protest at what they described as morally unjustifiable £77 tickets. Supporters chanted, "Enough is enough, you greedy bastards," to the club's billionaire American owners, and In the final 10 minutes of the match, Liverpool surrendered a 2-0 lead to draw 2-2 against Sunderland. It frightened the life out of Liverpool's American owner, John W. Henry, and a few days later, Liverpool U-turned on the price rises, lowering their most expensive tickets from £77 to just £59. Just. 10 years on, the most expensive matchday ticket at Liverpool, one of the biggest and best supported sports teams on the planet, is £61, only £2 more than it was in 2016, and the cheapest, reserved for locals in the main stand upper, is £9. You can, in fact, just do stuff. In 2009, by contrast, when the San Francisco Giants pioneered so-called dynamic pricing, which was subsequently adopted by almost all major American sports teams, and by FIFA for the first time at the 2026 World Cup, there was no major backlash or organised protest by supporters. This is what is meant by the cut mentality of some American sports fans. I would say, for the want of a better term, but I think it actually sums it up pretty well. Even FIFA, though it is primarily gestural and insignificant, fell backed into a corner and released a small number of much cheaper 2026 World Cup tickets for national associations to redistribute to their members and most loyal supporters as a result of intense backlash, not in the United States, where most of the World Cup is being held, but from Europeans and major European FAs, who kicked up a fuss regarding ticket prices, causing FIFA some embarrassment. It is a very minor concession in the grand scheme of things, but it is relevant because when football fans complained about World Cup ticket prices, there were lots of people who told them to just put up with it, and that complaining wouldn't do anything. As is illustrated by FIFA's feeble backtracking, the Premier League campaigns already alluded to in this video, and much more vociferous ones in countries like Germany, resulting in significantly cheaper tickets still, that just plainly isn't true. Among those who accept that you can just do stuff, and you don't have to lie down, roll over, and accept your fandom being exploited, in the name of supply and demand, there is another line of thinking which claims that any sporting event with excess demand is going to be inherently exclusionary, which is true, and supposes that any system of exclusion, whether that is based upon wealth, loyalty, or on a first-come, first-served basis, is equally fair and morally justifiable, which isn't true, at least in my opinion. Artificially suppressed ticket prices may result in massive waiting lists, which punishes newer or younger fans, but that is not the equivalent, quite plainly, in my view, of punishing people who may have been lifelong fans and supported a team when they were down and out, and supply exceeded demand, on the basis of wealth or social status. I think that is obviously worse, more unjust, and also results in much worse atmospheres. The Beatles' final rooftop concert was exclusionary, in the sense that it was unannounced and the general public weren't aware of it, which excluded those who didn't happen to stumble by 3 Savile Row at the exact time that it was happening, whilst favouring those who did, but I would posit that it would have been much less romantic and fabled if it had been held at the Royal Albert Hall to a crowd exclusively of multimillionaires who paid thousands of pounds to be there. I think that some systems of exclusion are actually preferable to others. The reason for these contrasting attitudes and cultures stems both from broader societal and economic influences, and some which are specific to sport. European football clubs, and the nomenclature is significant here, were founded often as literal clubs, with members, who naturally didn't or still don't want to price themselves out of watching their own team, whereas American sports teams are often referred to as franchises. They are, in some cases, and only some, much less historically rooted and embedded in their local communities. They have never been owned or controlled by supporters, and some have even moved cities and states, which is an alien concept, as far as most football fans are concerned. There is also a rational self-interest in keeping ticket prices artificially low, even at clubs which may no longer be owned by members, and may even be owned by American billionaires now, not only through fear of creating fan revolt, but because that toxic atmosphere could cost them more than it generates. The atmosphere for a big game at Anfield, Old Trafford, St James's Park, the San Siro, the Westfalen Stadion, or indeed just about any European ground, and there are even more extreme examples outside of Europe, is widely considered by players and coaches as well as supporters themselves to have a significant impact upon the team, their performances and results, which can ultimately be worth far more than a marginal increase in matchday revenue as a result of hiking ticket prices. Both Premier League and NFL clubs on average make about 20% of their revenue, so a fifth, through ticket sales and matchday income. Manchester City made about the same amount of money in the Champions League last season, in which they only reached the knockout playoffs, as they did through matchday revenue. If increasing ticket prices by 10% cost them even 3 points, as a result of the toxicity it would create and the reduced atmosphere inside of the stadium, then it likely wouldn't be worth it, even from an economic standpoint. Atmospheres are still one of football's unique selling points, and why it is by far the most beloved and popular sport worldwide. This has been diminished in the likes of the Premier League and La Liga by gradually increased ticket prices, and gradually older, greyer and balder crowds as a result, but not yet entirely eroded. Unlike at the Super Bowl, which is a soulless, passionless event, which takes place in a stadium populated by corporate clients, sponsors, and people named in the Epstein files, with a net worth greater than the GDP of some countries, and who haven't seen each other since they attended Trump's inauguration. The 2026 World Cup final, the biggest event in all of world sports, will be largely the same. That ought to shame football, and serve as a warning, as if one were needed, of what is at stake here. American billionaires have been buying up European football clubs at an alarming rate in recent years, including some of the continent's biggest and most prestigious clubs, like AC Milan, Inter Milan, Liverpool, Manchester United and Chelsea. 12 Premier League clubs are now part-owned by Americans, and 11 are majority American-owned. Once they reach 14, the magic number, assuming that they act in unison, or have the support of ideologically aligned non-American ownership groups, they, as the Premier League's shareholders, can dictate the future of the league in almost all areas. The only safeguard that we, as fans, have are fans themselves, and, to a lesser extent, I suspect most people would anticipate, governments, who have done little to stand up to American capital and American billionaires in recent years. There is a fundamental ideological disagreement between people who view sporting events as being indistinct from any other form of leisure and entertainment, whether that be a trip to Disneyland or watching a Taylor Swift concert, and those who view football clubs, and other sports teams, as important cultural institutions rooted deeply in their local communities, and attending their games through thick and thin as a ritualistic, almost quasi-religious pastime. This may all sound a little bit misty-eyed and sentimental, but the 2026 World Cup provides not so much of a glimpse as a slap in the face as to the dystopian alternative that billionaire owners will impose upon sports fans, as they have in America, if not met with sufficiently fierce opposition.